Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today, and so sorry for the technical difficulties, and thank you for your patience. So Michael has kindly agreed to join us today, and thank you to him as well. He is a professor of cognitive neuroscience at Birkbeck University, London. His lab focuses on developmental neuroscience, and it uses multidisciplinary methods to understand the brain and cognitive bases of cognitive variability. And it was awarded the Queen's Anniversary Prize for the higher education. He's also the director of the Center for Educational Neuroscience, a cross-institutional research center which aims to further translational research between neuroscience and education and establish new interdisciplinary accounts in learning. He's also a fellow of many societies, including the Association of Psychological Science and the Higher Education Academy, in addition to being on the Learners Council and also previously a member of our very own IMBIS board. So clearly you have a great experience in this world, and we're really, really looking forward to learning from you today. Thank you.
Super. Thanks very much, Sylvia. So I will share some slides, hopefully. You'll see those?
Yeah, we can see. Yep, there we go. Perfectly.
And if I press this button, does it move? Yeah. So good?
Yes, there we go. Yep.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, so my brief is I'm going to talk for like 15 minutes. And then that's just a warm up to generate lots of questions. And then you're going to ask me lots of questions. So I will do my very best. Okay, so let me introduce myself a little bit further. This is a busy slide, so I apologize about that. But, you know, I'm trying to summarize everything I do on one slide. And it's just to give you a sense that I have a kind of dual role. My lab is called the Developmental Neurocognition Lab, and that's more on the basic research side. So I'm interested in how things work, and my lab investigates broadly cognitive variability. So how cognition can work differently in different people. That is, whether those people are of different ages or the same age and different ability levels. And I'm interested in combining lots of methodologies to do that. So, you know, I'll take any data I can get, but I'm interested in behavioral data and brain imaging data and genetic data. I'm interested in computational models and brain scanning, these kind of things. I'm sort of interested in the theory of how you put together various different fields. So I've been working on some ideas that your cognitive theories and your developmental theories really have to match up with how the brain works, and the brain works the way it does because of biology. But if you want to understand how biology works, you have to understand how evolution works. So ultimately, you're going to have to fit together all these different disciplines. Those are kind of big theoretical thoughts. But if you go on the left-hand side, this is my role as director of the Center for Educational Neuroscience. So terminology, mind-brain education, educational neuroscience, I'm just going to pretend they're the same thing. I know there may be disputes about that or subtle differences, but we're all playing the same game. We're all interested in a dialogue between education and research and how we can mobilize the evidence to improve educational outcomes and children's well-being in the education system. So Center for Educational Neuroscience was set up in 2008, so it's been going a few years now. And I've just listed there some of the projects that we're involved in. Some of those are trials to evaluate what works. So we've done research in primary school looking at maths and science. We were involved in with a company called Evolve, looking at a more holistic mentoring intervention program. We're just starting off a project at the moment, targeting something very specific in children's learning of grammar in 11 and 12-year-olds, looking at whether we can help understand grammar for writing. We've also done some work on adult literacy programs in low-income countries. And most recently, some work using meta-analyses to try and understand what works in special educational needs and disabilities. We also have a kind of set of research projects in various different areas. For instance, looking at the effects of cell phone usage on children's well-being and their cognitive development in adolescence. Some work on effects of socioeconomic status differences on developmental trajectories, some work on bilingualism, artificial intelligence, even a little bit now to get with the zeitgeist on neuroscience, climate change and sustainability. And we also do some dissemination. We have some books out, some resources on our website. All of this is supposed to do some basic research, some intervention research, and some dissemination to support the dialogue between research and education. Okay, so that's me. A lot of bits and pieces going on. I'm going to try and paint a vision for you. Let's leap forward some decades. Who knows how long this is going to take? But can we imagine when we've got this dialogue up working properly between educators and researchers, what would that look like? And people will have different visions, but I like to have something in mind, a destination that we're heading to, and this is my current one. The idea of researchers working on the science of learning sort of being research and development support to teachers, a bit like the way there's a big kind of research pharmaceutical industry support doctors and general practitioners. And it's not a competition. No one's speaking up or speaking down to anyone. It's just the researchers are trying to come up with new approaches, new interventions, new methods that may help teachers in the classroom, give teachers more information about what works, what's effective, what are the important factors. And maybe in this vision, you could think about teacher training, having more training about research literacy and how learning works, and that to be sort of continuously updated. But also some kind of the strengthening the reverse dialogue. So research being more sensitive to the current challenges in the classroom, and also policy priorities feeding down and updating research agendas. And then gradually this accumulation of evidence about what works, what are the important factors going on in various different countries, understanding what are the important contexts that shape what works, and the establishment of authoritative organizations kind of serving as the gatekeepers to commission intervention trials, to assemble evidence bases and so forth. And then maybe some innovation going on there. So basic research kind of discovering new things, but also that being a process of co-creation with educators to try and think about how can we innovate given what we're discovering in research to impact what's going on in the classroom. So that's a vision. I don't know how far exactly we are towards that. This is my kind of nested, embedded, multicolored diagram, and it just keeps me honest to understand that if we're doing mind-brain education or educational neuroscience, we have to understand the broader constraints that the education system is working within. Often we're focusing on individual level factors. That's the brown sitting at the center of this diagram. But we have to understand that in the context of school factors, things like what school policies are, classroom environments are, teacher skill levels, the level of resources available to teachers in teaching resources. And then we have to understand the wider cultural factors, things like factors like socioeconomic status or the new technologies existing in society. And then more broadly still thinking about the policy level, thinking about government, say in the UK, we have like a national policy, a national curriculum. I know in North America, things may be a little bit more separate by state. And you don't have that kind of broad consensus, but there still will be a local budget for education. How many teachers? These kind of things. So while we're doing educational neuroscience, we have to understand that broader context. So I'm going to introduce Learners. Learners is an organization in the UK. It is a charitable think tank a bunch of well-meaning individuals getting together thinking that can we support and realize the potential of the interface between researchers and educators. This is their mission statement. Learners is dedicated to bring educators and researchers who specialize in the study of the brain, the mind, and behavior together in order to use the insights gained from high-quality research to improve and enrich learning for all. Why am I introducing learners? Well, I'm on the Council of Learners. I'm very happy to work with them. They're a great bunch of individuals. And fortunately, they had the foresight last year to commission a national polling service to actually go out and ask teachers, what do they know about education and neuroscience, and what did they think about it? How was it affecting their practice in the classroom, if at all, and what did they want more from education and neuroscience? So the poll was over 1,000 teachers, a representative sample, 630 classroom teachers, 375 senior leaders. And I'll just pick out some of the answers to the many questions these kind teachers responded to in the survey. So first off, just to understand what is the context of UK teachers, what is important for them right now. So they were given a list of possible factors, and this is a summary of the ones that they rated as the most important. So you can see for the average teacher in the classroom in the UK, their workload is the most important thing playing on their mind. And then behind that, we have funding cuts, resourcing levels, and then we have student behavior. And then there's other stuff in there. Yes, pedagogy, sure it's important, but you can see these are the major priorities for teachers. So anytime we're arguing about what are better ways to do teaching, what are superior learning methods, teaching methods, and all of that has to be understood about the context of what is it like to actually be a teacher in the classroom right now. How aware were teachers of education and neuroscience as a sort of pedagogical approach to inform your teaching and learning practices using education and neuroscience? Well, you can see only about 1/3 of the teachers were aware of it. Inquiry-based learning, collaborative learning, reflective learning were more pervasive in the awareness of current UK teachers. So we asked them, they were all pretty enthusiastic about educational neuroscience, even though only 1/3 of them heard of it. They were 3/4 of them thought it was a good idea and they'd like to use it. These were the top things, the top ways that they thought insights from mind-brain education might inform their teaching. So top one up there is to help me understand students' learning by taking stages of brain development into account. Next one, to provide better approaches to dealing with individual learning difficulties. I'm spotting all sorts of typos in my slides. I know I feel bad about throwing them together so quickly. And third, increasing the available techniques I have to support learners. So I think there's good insight and like thirst for this kind of information to inform teachers' practices. But if they are going to use these kind of insights, they did say, well, first of all, they'd like a smaller workload, some time available to actually use the information they're being given from research. For sure, they would like more information, perhaps in dedicated continuing professional development sessions. But also they wanted more information on how to apply the insight, the actual detail of, well, yeah, how do you use that in a practical way in the class? So stages of brain development, what does that actually mean for the difference between what I'm doing now and what I should be doing? So that's actually what teachers think at the moment. Let's give a sort of global view of how well we're doing on that pathway to the vision I painted for you in the UK. In some ways, we're doing okay. We're making good progress. So particularly with the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, this is a charitable organization set up by the Department for Education. Now, I think it's been going more than 10 years, about 10 years. They can commission randomized controlled trials to investigate what works in the classroom, various methods in literacy and numeracy and science training, and finding out does getting your class to do yoga work? Does making them more physically fit, does that work? Does improving their sleep regime, does that work? So they are building gradually an evidence base. They have commissioned and completed, I think not all of them done, but somewhere of the order of 200 randomized control trials now. And they commission regular reports and meta-analyses summarizing the evidence base. So I think in the UK, we're doing reasonably well in advancing the evidence base. For example, this is a slide the Education Endowment Foundation puts together all its findings into a toolkit in a way to help educators make decisions about what techniques to use in their classroom. This is the type of accessible summary they try and produce, where they are just playing off effect size for each technique. How many months gain in learning would that give you compared to pupil cost? Now, so we know one-to-one tuition gives impressive gains, but it's also very expensive. But there are some things that we think would be effective, like having extra teaching assistants in the classroom. They're expensive, but they turn out to have very little effect on educational attainment. But something like feedback, peer tutoring, these are relatively low cost and have shown quite big effect sizes. In terms of dissemination, again, I think we're improving a bit there. We're getting a little bit better from the research direction anyway, of communicating to teachers, of putting the evidence base in a format that may be usable for teachers. So I'm showing you some books that have come out of our research, and there's I think a nice paper by Paul Howard-Jones and colleagues trying to capture all the neuroscience and put it into a heuristic of learning in the classroom in terms of a sort of engage phase, a build knowledge phase, and a consolidate stage. There are policy briefs. For example, there's work on inclusion from Duncan Astl's team in Cambridge. And the other graphics that are showing you our recent work trying to summarize the research evidence on neurodevelopmental conditions. Where we're not doing so well, I think, in the UK is optimizing the dialogue between researchers, educators, and policymakers. So I'll give some examples that, to me, my impression is that research agendas are not sufficiently shaped by classroom challenges. So there's not enough of a conduit back from the classroom to change what researchers are investigating. I think research ideas, there's some great ideas, some great insights out there, but they're not always readily translated into forms that can be implemented in classroom practice. So that's one of the challenges. What does this research mean in day-to-day practice in the classroom? I think educators, there's a lot of sense that they value research evidence and they want researchers to answer questions for them. But because research literacy is not part of teacher training, at least in the UK, they don't necessarily have a sense of what questions can be readily asked by researchers, of how to take some question they have and actually ask it in a form that researchers can go off and pursue that question. Policymakers are not really funding translational infrastructure. I'll have a bit more on that in a second. I think it's promising that policymakers in the UK have now suggested that trainee teachers should have some content on the science of learning theory. But that still could be improved because, again, there's not a link in that training to what that means in the classroom. And also, for whatever political reasons, the version of mind-brain education that ended up in that curriculum for trainee teachers is a sort of slightly strange, old-fashioned 1980s memory-based view of learning called cognitive load theory, which, again, I can say more on if you are interested. But this is a little bit more on gaps. In the UK at the moment, we have quite decent funding for basic research in abilities that are relevant for education. And as I've talked about with the Education Endowment Foundation, we've got unusually a decent amount of funding together with other charitable foundations like the Nuffield Foundation. We've got good resources for evaluation, for running randomized control trials and meta-analyses and so forth. What we don't have is any way readily to fund innovation to move between basic research, and where are these new techniques coming from to be evaluated? And it's there that I've been working. Sorry, I'm throwing this slide in. It's I'm going to say the UK government knows how to do this stuff in other areas. So particularly for industry, the UK government funds innovation hubs to get all the experts together to crack a problem in society or fill a gap in the market in terms of products. But we're just not very good in doing this at the moment in mind, brain, and education. So the last bit is to talk about the Building Impacts Group project, which is something that I've been working with learners on to try and propose what that kind of project will be. What would an innovation hub for mind, brain, and education look like? And at the moment, we have put together this proposal for a project. We're trying to raise funds around it, but as I just talked about, that this kind of thing is not generally funded. I don't know whether the position is better internationally, but the kind of thing you want to do is have a dialogue where you're actually putting researchers and teachers in the same room together, not just to have a jolly conversation, to be enthusiastic about the potential, but actually to try and problem solve, to come up with ways that the current research could be translated into potential new activities in the classroom, and ways that classroom challenges could redirect the research agenda. So this is a sort of mechanistic proposal for kind of like to have a whole set of meetings trying to be representative across the current challenges in the education system. I would say at the moment, left to its own devices, there's rather too much basic research done on numeracy and literacy, a little bit on science. Go to look at history, geography, sports science, very little, the arts, very little research there. It's not a representative coverage. Whereas if we have more systematic structures like this, which are built around decision-making and innovation, then perhaps we have more potential to innovate in a more systematic rather than a piecemeal way. Okay, yes, build infrastructure for translation innovation. That is what the big project is aiming to do. Okay, that's my introduction. Now we are moving on to the Ask Me Anything bit. So I'll stop sharing. I do a few other slides, secret slides, if you ask me really tricky questions, I've got reserved slides here.
Send in the slides.
I'll stop sharing and go ahead, ask me some questions.
Thank you, Michael. So yes, since we're a little bit later on time, I'll start with opening the floor first for anyone who has questions. Otherwise, I can go on with our questions.
This is Jane Bernstein. I'm in Boston. I'm a neuropsychologist at Boston Children's Hospital, and I also do work in the English-speaking Caribbean.
Right.
First of all, I really enjoy your last comment where we have far too much, not far too much, I understand that, but we've been so focused on literacy and numeracy, and there's so much else we need to know, and certainly the brain does a lot more than that. But my other question to you is, when you're looking at these larger educational sort of landscapes, what's your thinking about the role of the principals and whether they need individual training? Because I see really good teachers on the front lines who are not supported by equally interested principals behind them. So I'd love for your comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the reality of the teachers. If you even convince them about what new research information they should get their heads around and how it might be used in the classroom, they're not going to have any airtime or indeed flexibility to change their practice unless they're getting senior management support. I don't know. So sometimes I think about my vision, which is like 50 years ahead, and I think, well, I'll just focus on training the new teachers and then just like wait a few decades till we've changed the the teaching world, but that's not the reality, right? So we need to be having communication at multiple levels, and that certainly in the UK that is done through the government, because we have a more centralized department here that can issue edicts, that we can simultaneously try and work with continuous professional development, training new teachers. But there is an issue that senior leaders who are longer in their tooth are going to be a harder sell. So I think they need to be convinced with harder data about immediate potential to improve academic outcomes, which is obviously what they're trying to do for their individual institutions.
Yeah, and I mean, also, I think something like the big project where they just have the roundtable discussion, they have the opportunity to even just learn about what can be possible, might make this process a little bit more feasible. Okay, we have another question from Priya. Thank you so much for your presentation and for all your work you have done to establish the field of EN MBE. I'm very interested in how the infrastructure for translation can be built. I agree with your assessment that this is a significant missing piece. So I guess if we can elaborate on infrastructure.
Yeah, so in this world of what we're doing right now, Zooming, it's actually about putting the right people in rooms and then having dedicated decision-making mechanisms to try and produce output. So it takes resources, but compared to the £1 million projects that you're regularly seeing being funded, actually it's kind of peanuts. So what we're engaged in with learners is to make this argument clear. But it's who do you start with when you're saying your funding structure is wrong? It's not like making a really good grant application because there's nowhere to send it, right? That's kind of the point. So it's really trying to have soft influence of making this argument in whatever way you can. It seems to me frustrating because we do get good piecemeal bits of translation. And I'll give a couple of examples. There is some dialogue going on. The Education Endowment Foundation finally realized that all the RCTs they commissioned weren't directly addressing what was going on in the classroom. So they've launched a new program called the Teacher Choices Program, which are going to end up being RCTs, but they are purely arising from questions that teachers have had about their day-to-day practice, about saying, in this type of situation, some of the teachers like to do this, and some of the teachers like to do this. Some of them like to give modeled examples, whereas other teachers allow the students to work with discovery learning, for example, which is better. And that is now using all the evaluation and researchers who are involved in one of these projects, going and looking at the literature, but ultimately it is to drive to evidence to inform current practice. And we have a professional body called the Chartered College of Teaching in the UK that has been polling all its teachers. Tell us about cognitive science. What more do you want to hear about research from these guys? Ask us, so we can pass that on. And they've just published a report in 23, which I can summarize it in like 2 sentences. They want to know, how do we implement cognitive science theory in the classroom? 1. Number 2, you've told us all these things are important, like retrieval practice and space learning, all these kind of things. Can we combine them all? How do we combine them? So there's all these kind of piecemeal. So the sense is there's a lot of potential there, but it's just not being done systematically. There's not a systematic coverage of the research. There's not systematic translation. So it's a challenge. I'm here encouraging you. Tell your friends, tell your policymakers. Yes. All we can do is call it as we see it and see if we can make some progress.
Okay, I have a question that's a little bit geared towards early career trainees or PhD students. Going from doing the neuroscience in the lab, studying, like you mentioned, like neuroscience, biology, genetics, how do you go from this type of science to speaking the translation aspect and actually being able to bring your findings in a more applicable way to the rest of the world? How do you build this ability?
Yeah, if your goal is to be a translational researcher, first of all, fantastic. I think that's a brilliant goal. The second thing is, it's going to take some time. So we have dabbled in the UK of having interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary undergraduate courses. And to be frank, they don't really work because you don't get a deep enough grounding in any of the multiple topics you're being taught. So I think the reality is you have to, the training will be longer, and you have to have a very good grounding in one topic and then gradually add the next ones. So I would say you at least do an undergraduate in one, possibly a graduate level, say a master's level in the same topic, then maybe do a PhD in a slightly related topic and a postdoc in another one. And as you go along, I think you need to increasingly engage with other stakeholder viewpoints. So you are beginning to build a model in your head of all this stuff I'm doing. What does it look like from these other people's perspective? How's it going to be useful for them? And that's why the kind of work done by the Chartered College of Teaching or by learners, which is surveying the current state of these fields and allowing you to get a view of, it's very hard in a lab guessing what teachers want and what it's like to be a teacher, I'm teaching 36-year-olds and just getting them into their PE kit and then back into their regular uniform to get back, that's the kind of logistics. And from a research perspective, and you're thinking, how does working memory work? It's one has to be constructing in your head that pathway. So it's obviously taken me a little while to become maybe even transdisciplinary. But I think that can be speeded up, but I think it's still going to take like 5 years of training rather than 3.
If you had the opportunity to work on a project where it was flexible enough to kind of tailor the questions and methodology a little bit with educators, sit in a discussion with them, have you had any experience with this where educators can already explain to researchers what they're interested in, what questions they have inside the classroom, and how they feel about researchers coming in the classroom and like you said, running trials in the classroom or actually doing testing in the classroom?
Yeah, I don't think that works that well. In my experience thus far, in that I've been to too many research meetings or meetings with teachers and researchers where it doesn't feel like a genuine dialogue. It feels like the researchers are telling the researchers and expecting the teachers to hear. And everyone is super enthusiastic. And everyone walks out with a warm glow, being super enthusiastic, and then nothing ever happens. And that's why I think that's what enthusiasm is good, right? But if we want to make progress in it, I think 2 things need to happen. If you're going to get those kind of people in a room, you need to have a goal for the meeting, a concrete outcome. So you need to structure those kind of engagement situations better. And then the second thing that we need more of is co-creation activities. And that's a little bit what Big is about. The Big project is about getting educators and researchers to come up with new ideas together when they're in the same room, rather than researchers having their ideas first or teachers having their ideas first, and then because everyone's already kind of pre-bottled what they want to say, and it's not a genuine dialogue.
So then the Big project is a roundtable discussion for the dialogue for the discussion that happens before the research projects, but it's not for the translation, is it? For the translation of the findings?
Sorry, you dropped out there a second. Can you just repeat that?
So just to clarify then, the big project, its goal is to create a roundtable discussion before the science itself happens, and to understand from both sides, for a researcher to explain what the science is to date, and then discuss the possible questions with the educators.
Yeah, I see it less as a discussion and more as a decision-making process. We've already piloted these workshops to see how they would work. And it's the idea of, I mean, part of it is getting the right people in the room, but the idea is, you know, let's say you're interested in executive functions. You have like 3 researchers who are going to represent state-of-the-art research in executive functions. And then you have, say, teachers from early years, primary, secondary, and the researchers get to pitch what the state-of-the-art is. The teachers get to say, well, this thing, executive function that you're talking about, is what we think are the relevant challenges around that. Like, how do we sustain attention for like 40 minutes on boring stuff that's nevertheless in the curriculum? I mean, this is what it means for us. And then there to be a central bit of that meeting where you're trying to problem solve about, well, how could you use that research in a useful way, and what are unanswered questions from a research perspective. And then you're trying to come out saying, right, we need 3 new research directions and 3 new things from research that might be worth pursuing. And then if you do that across a representative 20 areas, you have a new research manifesto, and you've got a whole bunch of ideas that can be investigated, and you've done it in a way that gives you systematic coverage across all the issues that are relevant. So I see it more as decision making and innovation rather than discussion.
Yeah, great. Jane, would you like to go ahead and talk, or would you like me to read your comment?
Okay, I'm on a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but one of my big problems in the psych research applied to education is that lab stuff tends to focus on creating, you know, discrete tasks that are brought to bear. You know, kids need to have phonological processing, they need to have rapid naming, but when you're actually in the classroom or in real life applying your brain skills, that's a different sort of game. And you just said something there, Michael, about if you take executive functions, for example, you know, everybody breaks it down into cognitive flexibility, you know, this, and this. But it's actually the whole executive capacity is this integrated something or other, and just making attention better won't necessarily make the kid more effective. Do you know what I mean? So I worry in translational work but I really feel that we need to find research modalities to show that different contexts of teaching. And I think your context could be from, you know, the individual 3 kids in a group. Does that make a difference versus the bigger classroom? Or, you know, we've got this fancy technology coming down the line with, you know, video stuff. I think we should possibly be looking at how the skills we believe we want kids to learn are facilitated or challenged too much by different contexts. I think it's sort of in the literature, but it isn't focused on in a way that would give us the data for the recalcitrant teacher or policymaker. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're getting into deep waters with context, because that's one of the fundamental things that makes psychology hard, and is probably the basis of how the brain works, is that so many of our cognitive processes are context dependent. And a lot of the very sciencey view of how the mind works with this decomposition into componential skills, it's not clear it stands up when you look at global contexts of cognition. So I think that then the research challenge is you can't investigate all contexts, and if you want to get insight, you need experimental control. So that, you know, this is the importance is to collect data in a way that you can respect the context sensitivity. So I think a stepping stone towards that is precisely what you're saying, that you need researchers who are super happy about their experimental control by just studying an individual in a highly controlled context, and some teacher to say, we never do this activity as individuals, we always do it as groups. So at the very least, could you see whether this technique still works when it's done in a group context? So, I mean, we're beginning to do some of that work. Say we have our toddler lab here at Birkbeck, where we're using some of the imaging techniques to look at neural synchrony, to actually look at how these are toddlers and young kids, what's different about their cognition when they're interacting with a teacher or a parent or even a sibling or a friend. So I think that's important, and that's an ultimate direction of travel. But the first things we can do are to identify some of the separate contexts and start doing work about to what extent do our current findings generalize to those specific contexts.
Well, just a quick, on your initial slide, or one of the early ones, you showed that you're doing some work on socioeconomic impact on the trajectories, which I find is fits some of the work we're interested in. That would be interesting to know over time, because socioeconomic status indexes different contexts at one level. That will be interesting to see what you find, over time with that type of research. I mean, longitudinal research is what we all need all the time, but of course, funding it is a huge issue.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, this gets you into wider issues that at least in the UK, and I think in the US as well, there's a reasonable amount of evidence that school effects are smaller than family effects, at least on educational achievement. And in the UK, they were estimating that the maximum school effect on educational achievement is about 10%. And the home effect, so as picked up by socioeconomic status, is maybe 2-3 times as big as that. So we have to view that as in a more holistic sense, but this is also, if one has a global perspective, we need to understand that even though we see socioeconomic status gradients within each country, between country comparisons can often be quite misleading. And indeed, I've seen arguments that executive functions as a construct are a slightly westernized, individualistic idea, and they may not work in more collectivist and communal societies where many activities are not done on an individual basis, but on a more group basis. So I think, there's context, and then there's context as well.
Can I just throw into something you just said, and then I'll be quiet and let other people talk. The studies on the inheritance of IQ or intelligence, whatever you want to call it, and the issue of genes are more of an issue if you're in a higher advantage group, whereas environment's more of an issue if you're in a lower advantage group. Remember that work? So that if you don't have affluent parents who give you lots of conversation and access to museums and walking around the world and look then the school may in fact be much more powerful than the family. You know what I mean? You have to look at what the experience of the individual is coming through, you know what I mean? The experience of what all of the features that promote education. Anyway, I'll just throw that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Although I'm going to say that some of the complications we've got when we're looking at big cohort data are less about what that will be gene environment interaction, that certain environments allow the expression of genotype differences. So more affluent societies allow genetic differences to be expressed, but in poor families, everyone's being held back by lack of opportunity. So you don't see the genotypic differences. But certainly some of the UK work is suggesting that genetic variation is quite often correlated with environmental variation. And, you know, even very simple twin studies are telling us that of the variation we're seeing in children, about half of it's coming from genetic differences and about half of it coming from environmental differences. Very, very rough and ready. But it gets more complicated when those two bits of variation are correlated. So it may well be that we actually have more scope to change differences than we thought, or we actually had less to change differences. That at the moment, I mean, that is state-of-the-art work, trying to use these bigger and bigger samples and using kind of genetic measures of educational attainment and understanding how they work.
Thank you, Michael. Before I just capture the last two questions, I just want to say, since we only have about 5 minutes left, Michael has kindly agreed to join our pre-conference in July. So if you have more questions for him, definitely, if it's okay to email you, I can share the email and
yes, by all means, yeah.
Thank you. And of course, you can join us for the pre-conference in July. It will be in Belgium. You can register on the IMBIS website, and we'll have the information on Twitter as well. And we will also post this video to anyone who registered. Okay, so the first question is regarding bridging the gap on financial and budgetary issues when basically educators and scientists come together, and educators are really mostly worried about, okay, how are we going to make these ideas or these projects work with the budgets that we have? Pamela, please elaborate if I did not catch this.
I can do the short version, thank you. We were a group of education professors at the University of Georgia, and we were meeting with one of the largest school districts in Georgia to see what education research they thought would be useful. And we were all excited about student learning, and they were all excited about how to calculate how many school buses to buy. So I think, pertinent to Michael's comment earlier, we needed to structure that meeting better. And I'm interested in how you plan to structure the BIG groups.
Yeah, so there are different tricky parts to actually delivering on that project. I think for me, the biggest challenge is to make sure I'm getting the right people in the room. Somewhat easy is how to structure those meetings to make them productive in terms of decision making, in terms of having a chair establish the context and the goals of the meeting. So what is allowed and what is not allowed in order to get closer to the product that we want as an outcome of that meeting. I think that the budgetary issue is an important one. That's why the Education Endowment Foundation in mobilizing its evidence is not just about what works, but what works for what price. And that is specifically to enable decision makers in education to decide what they can afford. It is somewhat concerning that in the UK, a paper out a couple of years ago had a look at a sample of a few hundred schools and all the different techniques they were using, and almost none of them were being used for evidence-based reasons. There are a bunch of different reasons about to do with marketing or organizational inertia or the particular interest of say, the head of maths or so forth. I think there's a lot of scope of making information available to school decision makers about what is the best way to improve techniques in the classroom for least amount of money. I did have a conversation with an advisor to the UK cabinet at one point over coffee at some kind of workshop, and he said, I tell you what they really want to hear in the cabinet. They quite like education and neuroscience, but what they quite like to hear is 6 things that teachers could do tomorrow that they're not currently doing that would improve educational outcomes for no extra money, and 6 more that might work, but we're not quite sure, and we need to do a bit more research, again, for no extra money. So that, I mean, that is the policymaker view is can we just be doing things better in the classroom that doesn't cost anything more? But I think the broader picture is right, that we can't think about what's going on in the classroom and not think about budgets at the same time.
All right, thank you. So I'm not sure what Hattie's visible learning is. Susan, would you like to elaborate? And then this will be our last question for today.
Yes, good morning. So I'm joining you from Los Angeles. Our good morning, good morning. Our sort of executive level at LA Unified School District is looking at John Hattie's visible learning, which looks at effect sizes for different interventions in the classroom. But I'm wondering if you're familiar with that work and how that work might connect to your work.
Yeah, no, I mean, John Hattie's work is sort of pioneering work in trying to bring the evidence-driven, evidence-based approach into education. So he does loads of systematic reviews and meta-analyses in trying to establish what we can be confident about and how we can quantify that. I think that field is maturing a bit more, but there has in the past been contention about meta-analyses that they're counting apples and oranges or whatever, you know, combining things in a meta-analytic approach. But I think that the broad view is a really positive one, and I think that has influenced the Education Endowment Foundation's approach in this attempt to make the evidence base more rigorous. John Hattie's work is more about the evidence than how much it costs, and we still have the challenge of actually how these techniques bed down in day-to-day practice in the classroom. So I've been involved in some of the randomized control trials with the Education Endowment Foundation, and these trials go through a set of stages. So you start off just checking the feasibility of the technique's going to work, and then you do a pilot study, which I think our pilot study for one technique had like 800 kids in it. And if I'm a psychologist, I think my samples have like 50, and I'm impressed. 800 is a pilot study. We then had an efficacy study with 6,000 participants in it. And we went on to an effectiveness study, which we're just waiting for the results from now, with 9,000 students in it. But that's kind of, you feel like you're at the end of the road, but even then, actually what you want, even if you have some technique that works, is you want to have a kind of like a commercialization stage to actually put it into a form that teachers want to use, not that they're being told to use it in some kind of prescriptive, oh, do it because the RCT says, but actually see how it's advantageous to them to add it into their pedagogical practice.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. And one last thing I'd like to share with the group, we do a community-based survey, students, parents, teachers, administrators. Those data are public. We have about 500,000 responses, and it goes back 10 years of longitudinal data. So if anybody is curious as to what kids feel about their own abilities or their relationships with their teachers, I put the link in the site, and it's all public data because it's all anonymous data, but you're welcome to share.
Can I just quickly follow up on that? In that I've talked a lot about, if you understand more how the mind and brain works, you can improve teaching and learning maybe, but there is a kind of parallel argument that a lot of what we can do is to help pupils, students, teachers, and parents understand themselves more purely by disseminating knowledge. For example, particularly powerful to help adolescents and their teachers understand more about how things may be different in terms of, you know, sleep or, you know, decision making or these kind of things. So I think self-knowledge can be particularly powerful without necessarily saying, and it means you have to teach like this rather than this.